Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Dion. I'm very happy to be here. Today, I'll be presenting Nick's talk on his behalf. I'm not a historian, but a digital artist, and I'm also Vera's husband, which is why I'm here. But I do have a connection with the topic of Nick's talk, namely how to shape popular history. I'm currently working on a series of short biographies in the form of cartoons that introduce younger audiences to lesser known African American music pioneers, such as one of my favorite uh, people, Blind Tom. And hopefully you guys will get to see that at some point. But for now, let me begin with the talk once again on Nick's behalf. It's titled Outsiders' Grand Narratives, Gerda Lerner, John Hope Franklin, and the Politics of Popular American History. In 2003, 2 years after receiving the Bruce Cotton Prize for Lifetime Achievement in the Writing of History from the Society of American Historians, Gerda Lerner was asked about the state of contemporary feminist scholarship. Her response was characteristically direct, singling out the philosopher and gender theorist Judith Butler as a cautionary example. She argued, if I can't, with 2 advanced degrees and 70 years of intellectual life, read a page and comprehend it, excuse me, there's something wrong with her, not with me. If you cannot translate what you say into something that is translatable to the ordinary person, then you might as well be talking Latin or Aramaic. 9 years earlier, the Cotton Prize had been awarded to John Hope Franklin, whose landmark survey From Slavery to Freedom, a history of American Negroes, had by that point sold more than 3 million copies and been translated into 5 languages, and shaped the thinking of several generations of students and activists. Franklin, who spent much of his career navigating hostile critics from within the African American intellectual tradition, understood better than most what Lerner meant. Both historians have staked their careers on the conviction that history needed to be bold enough to explain the world. And both had paid a professional price for that conviction. I want to argue that Lerner and Franklin represent the clearest case studies of a structural paradox at the heart of 20th century popular historical writing. To reach politicized activist readers, such history needed the sweep and confidence of a grand narrative, but often the social movements of this type of writing fed into increasingly demanded attention to internal difference of race, class, gender, and sexuality that the grand narrative form tended to suppress. Both historians chose grand narrative as a deliberate, formal, and political strategy. A kind of outsider's weapon deployed against a profession that had marginalized their subjects. And both found that the weapon turned against them by the very movements that they had helped to create. Tracing that double movement, grand narrative as a political instrument, grand narrative as a political liability, illuminates something important about the relationship between historical form and political action in modern America. Why did historians working outside the mainstream of American historical profession reach for a grand narrative? The answer lies less in literary preference than in epistemological necessity. For Franklin and Lerner, synthetic ambition was a way of claiming structural depth and historical weight for subjects that the profession had dismissed as narrow, specialized, and sub-academic. To write a sweeping, confident history of African Americans or women was to insist that these were not subfields to be appended to national history, but that race and gender were fundamental factors in the development of American civilization. Both historians built on scholar activist predecessors before professionalizing their fields and reaching for synthesis. Franklin acknowledged deep debts to the tradition of African American historical writing that preceded him, from George Washington Williams through to Carter G. Woodson, whose Association for the Study of Negro Life and History had established institutional frameworks for the preservation and celebration of Black history from 1915 onwards. But he also recognized the limitations of that tradition, arguing in a 1957 essay that a new Negro history was required that would move beyond the celebratory impulse of Woodson's generation to the narrow focus of the white historical profession, insisting instead that Negro history is more than the overt actions of Negroes. It is also Americans' treatment of the Negro. It is the impact of forces and events affecting the lives of Negroes in countless ways. African American history, properly understood, was national history, and national history could not be properly understood without it. Lerner's equivalent formation was provided by her involvement with the Congress of American Women in the late 1940s, an organization whose publications drew on historical rhetoric to frame contemporary struggles for women's equality, and which developed her conviction that women's history was both an intellectual and political enterprise. By 1975, she was ready to articulate this conviction in programmatic terms, arguing in the journal Feminist Studies that a new theory was required that would take account of the fact that women's subjugation to patriarchal institutions antedates all other oppression and has outlasted all economic and social changes recorded in history. This will require a history based firmly on the recognition that women are half of mankind and have always been essential to the making of history. Like Franklin, she was insisting that her subject was not supplementary, but foundational. The grand narrative's most powerful political move for both historians was what might have been called the deep origin story. Franklin began from slavery to freedom in ancient Egypt and Ethiopia, arguing that civilizational achievements of these societies, shaped by the constant infiltration of African peoples from the South, provided the deep roots of African American identity. Lerner began her 2-volume project in ancient Mesopotamia, tracing the origins of patriarchy to the ancient Near East to demonstrate that patriarchy as a system is historical. It has a beginning in history. If that is so, it can be ended by historical process. These moves performed the same political function by pushing their narratives back to foundational movements that preceded the familiar periodization of national history. Both historians insisted that the conditions of the present were historically produced over millennia and therefore reversible. Structure became contingency, and contingency became the basis for political action. This is what distinguished their grand narratives from mere popular history. The claim was not simply that these stories were interesting, but that you could not understand or seek to change the world without them. The publishing histories of both historians' major works reflect the difficulty translating this ambition into popular form. Franklin fought for years to persuade Knopf to produce a paperback edition of From Slavery to Freedom, eventually threatening to withhold revisions before the company relented in 1969. Lerner endured more than 20 rejections from trade publishers before finding a sympathetic editor in Sheldon Meyer at Oxford University Press, who not only commissioned the creation of patriarchy and the creation of feminist consciousness, but actively encouraged their political radicalism. It should be part of your hubris, Meyer told Lerner, to make the assumption that anyone who has not embraced this viewpoint is part of the past. In each case, the historian's vision of popular history as activist tool required a publishing relationship that could accommodate rather than water down their political ambitions. Both historians also claim to write history of a large, internally diverse group, and both found that the claim contested, not primarily by conservative defenders of consensus history, but from within the social movement constituencies their ideas helped to create. For Franklin, the first serious challenge came from the Black Power generation of the late 1960s and 1970s. Vincent Harding, head of the Institute of the Black World and a leading proponent of radical Black history, argued that from slavery to freedom, one constantly feels that Franklin knows far more than he says about the ways in which the story of Black people might need to rip apart the white fabric of American history. Franklin Harding suggested repeatedly, comes to the brink of such total reevaluation and then draws back. producing a narrative whose final impact is still one of optimism about the movement of Blacks into the mainstream of America. The sociologist Orlando Patterson was more surgical in his critique, targeting the book's opening chapters on Egypt and Ethiopia as examples of contributionist history. An attempt to establish Black civilizational achievement as the basis for an argument about integration that ultimately accepted the terms of the dominant culture it claimed to challenge. For these critics, the problem with Franklin's grand narrative was not that it was wrong, but that it was not radical enough. It gathered evidence of structural oppression, but implanted that evidence with the liberal narrative of progress toward integration. They did not want a different ending to the same story. They wanted a different kind of story altogether. Lerner's critics made a structurally similar argument in a different register. Joanne Scott's landmark 1986 essay, Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysts, published the same year as the creation of patriarchy, argued that a rational understanding of gender that would move historians away from scholarship focused too narrowly and separately on women, and towards the relational nature of the links between both women and men's historical agency. Kimberly Crenshaw's articulation of intersectionality in 1989 pushed further, rejecting casual hierarchies that provided a vision of the path along which history has moved dialectically. For these theorists, Lerner's insistence on gender as the determinative factor in Western history was not simply an oversimplification, but an epistemological error that reproduced the universalizing logic it claimed to critique. They shared underlying argument. Across these very different intellectual contexts was precise. The grand narrative speaks for an abstracted, idealized version of the group, not its actual diversity. There is a productive irony here. Both historians had genuine commitments to intersectional thinking. Franklin had integrated social scientific work on race and class throughout, from slavery to freedom, and had published early in the Journal of Negro History on the questions of racial and gender. Lerner had argued since the early 1970s that the oppressions of gender, race, and class were intertwined and could not be treated separately, and had built her political career on that conviction. Yet the grand narrative form tended to override these commitments, imposing a casual hierarchy. Women's experience above all for Lerner, African-American experience as the lens through which all American history must be read for Franklin, that their own political instincts resisted. The form, in other words, was more reductive than the historians who used it. There is, however, a crucial distinction between the two cases. Franklin's critics told him his politics were wrong. His integrationism was a capitulation to the white mainstream. His narrative of progress, a liberal illusion. Lerner's critics told her that her epistemology was wrong. Her casual hierarchy was philosophically untenable. Her universalism, a form of false consciousness. Both charges arrived in different registers and demanded different responses. Faced with the structurally similar critiques, the two historians responded in ways that were strikingly divergent, and the divergence itself was analytically revealing. Franklin adopted the removal of the Egypt and Ethiopia chapters in 1974, fourth edition From Slavery to Freedom, was a direct response to Patterson's critique. Replacing the book's opening claim about ancient civilizational achievement with material that situated African-American history against the backdrop of decolonization and the emergence of modern West African states. The sixth edition of 1986, produced in collaboration with his co-author, Alfred Moss, substantially expanded the book's coverage of Black cultural history, jazz, spirituals, popular music, in response to reviewers who argued that the book had 5 references to Benjamin Franklin, but none to Aretha. The seventh edition of 1994 changed the subtitle from A History of Negro Americans to A History of African Americans, a concession to shifting nomenclature that Franklin had resisted for decades before accepting African American as a workable common ground. Each of these revisions was a response to pressure from activist readers, reviewers, and editorial processes, mediated through the commercial logic of a textbook that needed to retain its position as the dominant survey in a rapidly evolving field. The format, in other words, built adaptation into its structure. Franklin had no choice but to revise and process the revision, intellectually uncomfortable as it often was, allowed his grand narrative to evolve without abandoning its synthetic ambition. The cost of this adaptation was not negligible. Robin Kelly's observation that from slavery to freedom was cloaked in the protective armor of judicious prose captures both its enduring radicalism and the accommodations it had made to survive. Franklin remained fundamentally resistant to Black cultural nationalism, even as the book's revisions quietly incorporated many of the cultural nationalist movement's historiographical insights. The adaptation was real, but it was also selective, strategic, and sometimes reluctant. Lerner defended. Her dismissal of Butler was not an isolated eccentricity, but a crystallization of a lifelong commitment to the proposition that history needed to be accessible to be political. More substantively, her insistence on gender as the determinant factor in Western history was a coherent epistemological stance, not mere obstinacy. She understood that abandoning casual hierarchy, accepting a relational model in which gender, race, and class were equally weighted and mutually constitutive, would mean abandoning the political claim that made her grand narrative politically legible. That women's history explained the deep structure of the present in a way that could be grasped by non-specialist readers and used to change political consciousness. The grand narrative's utility, she understood, depended on its boldness. There were also structural reasons for the divergence in the responses. The monograph format offered Lerner no equivalent mechanism for revision. The creation of patriarchy and the creation of feminist consciousness could not be incrementally updated in the way from slavery to freedom could. More significantly, the timing was different. Franklin had decades in which to adapt his grand narrative as the field around him changed. Lerner was overtaken almost simultaneously with publication, with the theoretical frameworks that made her synthesis most vulnerable, arriving at roughly the same moment as the synthesis itself. Franklin had time to adapt. Lerner was, in a real sense, riding against the tide that had already turned. The deeper issue, however, is one that neither Franklin's adaptation nor Lerner's defense could resolve. Grand narrative's political utility depends on holding the line on casual hierarchy, on being willing to say that this factor, more than others, explains how the world came to be as it is. That casual boldness is precisely what makes grand narrative legible to popular audiences who need frameworks, not qualifications. But the same commitment makes it vulnerable to the charge of suppressing the very complexity it claims to illuminate. Both historians' grand narratives have proved more durable than their critics predicted. From Slavery to Freedom has sold more than 3 million copies and remains a staple of university classrooms. The creation of patriarchy and the creation of feminist consciousness continue to generate the kind of readerly engagement that academic historians rarely achieve. The letters that Lerner received from readers, the architect who found in the creation of patriarchy a sobering pattern that reordered everything I ever learned and experienced. The reader in Japan who wrote that the creation of feminist consciousness gave her the courage to press on in my own studies, knowing that other women have struggled to be more than auxiliary persons. testify to a capacity for effective as well as intellectual engagement that more theoretically sophisticated historiography has not replicated. Debraham's description of From Slavery to Freedom as an instrument of liberation that reached into my past speaks to the same quality. These were might be called implicated readers, people who did not simply process the rational arguments of the book, but fell in love with them, generating deep personal connections to their content. The grand narrative's durability is not despite its ambition, but because of it. The critics were largely right on the epistemological question. Grand narratives do suppress internal difference, and Franklin and Lerner's synthesis was less attentive to the full complexity of their subjects than the scholarship that followed them. But the same critics were largely wrong on the political question. Without synthetic ambition, activist history loses its capacity to reach and move activist audiences. That double verdict is the condition under which popular history has always operated, and it's no less operative today, when the relationship between academic history and public political life is again urgently contested. The comparison between these two historians is finally illuminated by a biographical asymmetry that their shared formal choices tend to obscure. Lerner was born in Vienna in 1921, formed by the political catastrophes of interwar Central Europe, and arrived in America as an exile who had, in her own words, fallen in love with the country, without surrendering the outsider's critical perspective that her European formation had given her. Franklin was born in Rentsville, Oklahoma, in 1915, shaped by the realities of American racial segregation from childhood, and built his career within and against the institutions of a country that simultaneously celebrated and excluded him. They came to their grand narratives from very different directions, shaped by different urgencies. Yet both reached for the same historical form, the sweeping synthesis, the deep origin story, the activist readership, the writerly confidence, because both understood that popular history, to do its political work, needed to be bold enough to explain the world. From where we sit today, that shared formal discovery may be the most interesting thing about the comparisons between Franklin and Lerner. The grand narrative was not an European import, nor was it simply an American vernacular. It was the form that two historians, formed by radically different experiences of exclusion and displacement, independently identified as the instrument best suited to the task they had set themselves: to write history that could change the consciousness of people who needed it the most. Thank you.